And welcome to No BS Baking. I'm JP, and today I want to tackle a question I see almost daily, seemingly everywhere online. Is my bread overproofed or underproofed? It's not just about bread size, it's about all sorts of issues home bakers face. Some are obvious, like dense, low-volume loaves, while others are subtle, such as gummy lines or large, oddly placed holes in the crumb. So let's dive in. Well, I love scrolling through the comments on baking forums, but if you're truly trying to diagnose a bread fault, you'd likely end up more confused than when you started. You get the full spectrum of advice: underproofed, overproofed, over or undermixed, underbaked, yeast issues, and it goes on. Now, the reality is any number of these things could be true, and they probably can't be diagnosed with real accuracy from just a photo. This leads to a whirlwind of conflicting advice that can actually make things worse. However, by gaining a fundamental understanding of the common causes of bread faults, you can take planned, controlled steps to truly optimize your baking. Now, it really does please me to see people that really trying to get to the bottom of their baking objectives, like the person in the post. Here's a look at the minor fault that he or she is trying to get sorted. So what could cause this gummy dense line? So let's deal with this common issue first and then move on to a more in-depth look at under and overproofing. You think you baked this beautiful loaf, but slice into it and bam, dense gummy line at the bottom, or maybe even worse. Now, what went wrong? It's an often asked baking mystery, and usually it boils down to a few basic things. First up, overhydration. We often push for higher hydration for that open, airy crumb. But too much water, especially with certain flours, simply won't evaporate during baking. It collects at the bottom, creating a wet, dense layer. Think of it like a soggy sponge. Next, you got underbaking. Your loaf might look golden on top, but if the internal temperature doesn't reach around 190 to 210 degrees Fahrenheit, that moisture stays trapped, particularly at the base. Cutting into hot bread also seals that moisture in. Patience is key. Always let your bread cool completely on a wire rack. Now, this brings us to heat. The bottom of your loaf needs ample heat to set properly. An uncalibrated oven or one not fully preheated means uneven baking. The bottom just isn't getting the heat it needs to cook through. Additionally, you've got pan problems. If your baking pan isn't conducting heat well, or you're not using preheated baking stone or steel, the base of your bread struggles to bake at the same rate as the top. Gravity pulls the dough down, and without quick heat set, becomes compressed and gummy. And then, of course, you've got gluten development and proofing. Weak gluten can't hold its structure, leading to dense spots, and both underproofing and overproofing can result in collapsed gummy crumb. Now, if you're using a pan, depan immediately after baking and place it on a cooling rack so air can get to all the surfaces. Smothering your baked bread in a pan for too long creates condensation, which leads to the soggy bottom syndrome. In short, that gummy bottom is a sign your bread needed more time, more heat, or a little less water as the most common culprits. When people think about under or overproof doughs, they often translate this into a volume thing. The dough's short in volume, feels tight and strong. It's got to be underproofed. The dough's huge, light, airy, and more delicate to the touch. For sure, overproofed. Well, actually, these may be indicators, and they may just as easily not be what you're assuming. So let's look at this. In simple terms, these definitions hold true, but let's look into some of the whys behind this stuff. Plastic underproofed breads are usually lower in volume and have a dense, often gummy grain. Well, beyond just volume, proofing profoundly impacts your final bread. Faults can include poor oven spring, radical bursting, or capping where the top crust separates from the loaf. Now, before we dive in, let's assume your yeast is active and within date. The dough's ability to proof properly relies on a few fundamental baking principles. First, ensuring your dough is mixed properly to a good gluten development, ideally reaching or nearing the window pane stage. Second, confirm your dough has enough water so that the gluten isn't underhydrated and can form that nice extensible web. And third, that you're given it sufficient bench rest or time to properly condition the gluten, allowing for easy expansion. Now, underproofing often happens when your yeast level isn't balanced for your kitchen's temperature or the ingredients in your recipe. For instance, too much sugar can actually delay yeast activity, as we know. Now, both of these might push you to bake the loaf before it's fully proofed, simply due to time constraints. Now, another common issue arises when you use a recipe as is, without considering your dough weight relative to your pan capacity. If your pan or basket is a different size, your dough might become unmanageable if fully proofed. And I've seen many people look at the size of the dough in relation to their pan or basket and say, well, it's got to be ready for the oven. Truth is, it often isn't. Optimum rise should not be determined from just visual cues, but using the poke test, a simple yet great indicator for determining when the dough is ready to be baked. There are two stages where this test is commonly used. The first is after the bulk rest. In this stage, the poke test is usually a little deeper, up to around the first joint of the finger. If the dough springs back about 50%, but does not completely fill in the indentation, then it's generally considered done. If it completely fills the area, it's not ready. And if it does not fill it in at all and maybe even collapses slightly, you probably pushed it a little bit too far. In the final proof stage, you don't need to be as aggressive with your poke test. Usually nail bed depth, or slightly less, is sufficient, and the same recovery indicators hold true. Next, we will review faults associated with both over bulk fermentation and over final proofing. Over fermented doughs, meaning you left it too long during bulk fermentation, is often stringy, sticky, difficult to work with. It often smells very yeasty or like alcohol. They can exhibit excessive weakness when handled, or prone to collapse, and flow or spread excessively. For general reference, I provided this visual. Now, under-fermented doughs, which can also to some degree extend to final proofing, result in often maybe dense, gooey crumb, lower in volume, and may contain large holes or rips, tears, both internally and externally, as in the case of bursting or capping. The other hand, over-fermented or overproof doughs often result in the degradation of structure, gluten strength, and may also contribute to an environment not conducive to good yeast health. Or simply, the food supply runs out and the yeast can no longer produce enough gas to keep the rise in play. This often translates into a low volume collapsed bread that usually exhibits a crumbly, slightly open cell structure, has a tendency to flow horizontally versus gaining height, or a loaf with a flat or sunken top crust and sharp corners when baking pan is used. When dough overproofs, it essentially exhausts itself before it even hits the oven. This leads to a weak structure and disappointing bake. So let's break down the main reasons this happens. Too much yeast. If you add too much yeast, your dough will rise incredibly fast. The yeast quickly consumes its food, shortening the dough's conditioning time and leading to a weak, overproofed result. Too little yeast. This might seem counterintuitive, but even a small amount of yeast, given enough time, can eventually consume all the available sugars, especially during long, slow proofs, like in a cold fridge. The dough can still become overproofed as enzymes and bacteria continue to break down the gluten. Incorrect dough temperature. A dough that's too warm supercharges the yeast. This rapid activity causes quick expansion that can age your dough prematurely, resulting in weakness. And then you may have insufficient dough for the pan. So if your pan is not the same as the recipe authors, and let's say it's a bit bigger, the amount of dough may not be enough. Now, you'd be tempted to push that dough to get that extra height, but this can lead to an overproof dough that collapses. Right amount of dough for the right size pan. So, with respect to flour, your flour might not be strong enough for your chosen hydration and overall fermentation plan. Stronger bread flours provide the gluten necessary to support longer fermentation times. Starting with a good bread flour is always a safe bet, and you can experiment with weaker flours later. Doughs with a higher water content can ferment more quickly. So, as noted, if you're using a weaker flour, you're more prone to overproofing, so pay close attention. Never trust time over observation. Now, many recipes provide time estimates, but never trust in these. There are many factors that influence proofing, as we know. Never solely rely on the clock. Always watch your dough's progress, especially when trying a new recipe. Your dough will tell you when it's ready. Well, I don't think we need to go through all the underproofing stuff, as we pretty much covered all of this in the details in the previous section, albeit in reverse. Now, I just wanted to say that fermentation and proofing can be a complex science if you really dig into all the details and all the little faults that can drive even home bakers crazy trying to get to the bottom of all of this. But to keep this video short as possible, I've created a detailed overview of fermentation and proofing in a new book that I will be adding to the Baking Assistant. This book ties in directly with the last book of the processing series on dough development and conditioning, which also gets into cold fermentation and proofing processes. Now, it seems like I'm always cheaping about the Baking Assistant. Well, it truly is a powerhouse of baking tools and reference material, and it's just getting bigger. Now, due to the increase in content and growing popularity, a modest price increase is planned for September, so get it today and lock in your price. Now, if you're still not sure, then check out the detailed overview I just completed. You'll be glad you did. Link in the description.